So here we are again, finally back with some more Graph Thunder. I've stalled long enough on working on this, so it's finally time to release the next EM Diagram Expansion Pack DLC. This update adds a few new features to the base game, but the main focus is of course the EM diagrams for almost every plane I thought was feasible as an air-to-air platform between 2.3 and 3.7. This is more than double the number of planes I previously tested, so you can imagine why this video took so long to make. If you haven't watched the previous parts of this series, I highly recommend you do so because unless you know how to read EM diagrams, you're going to be very confused. So, some notes before we get started. I've left out a few planes, mostly because testing 72 planes took long enough. The ones I've left out are either planes that I don't think are worth dogfighting in, or ones with similar flight performance to others, like the BF-109 F1 versus the F2. A lot of the premium vehicles were hard to test because I don't have them, meaning that when I test flew them, their crews were stock, and this made it very easy to G-lock whenever I'm doing turns, so it was a bit difficult to gather the data for, and so it might be a bit less accurate. My commentary on them will also be pretty limited since I've never played them in-game, so I'll mention that when it comes up. If you want a more direct comparison between two planes I've tested, you can always just go and check the drive folder and compare them yourself. The 72 planes is a lot to discuss, and some of these comments will get pretty repetitive, so I would highly just recommend skipping to graphs of the planes that you're interested in seeing and not wasting your time watching me talk about a bunch of different variants of attack aircraft that aren't really that good dogfighters. So without further ado, let's begin with some 4.0 4.3 planes that I missed last time around. Once again, these are all tested at 300 meters altitude on the highest engine settings, whether it's WEP or 100%, and right now the 4.0 versus 4.3 ones are going to be compared to the BF-109 F4. The A6M2 Mod 33 has a better instantaneous turn than the A6M3 since its wingtips aren't clipped, but it doesn't seem to be by that much. Their sustained turns and top speeds aren't that different either. The BTD1 has an okay turn radius but a poor energy retention and so a poor sustained turn. Just your typical single engine bomber. The Ki 61 1T is similar to the Ki 100 but has a bit worse of a sustained turn and a much worse climb thanks to its weaker engine. It very much relies on its air spawn to get into position, especially since it's at a higher BR than the Ki 100. The Me 410 has a very similar flight profile to the P61 but is much slower in terms of top speed. Frankly, when you're comparing any heavy strike aircraft in this BR range, they kind of just pale in comparison to the Wyvern. The Su-6 turns kind of okay, so it is workable, but it's still too underpowered to be that competitive in dogfight beyond taking head-ons. The T-18 flies similarly to the Me 410. The bomber air spawn and the good guns are really the reason you play this plane, but it's not impossible to dogfight if you use your flaps and altitude advantage as well. I kind of expected it to turn a bit better than this, but oh well. The Ta-154 at least has a better energy retention and straight line speed than some other heavy fighters, but it still doesn't seem to turn much better than any of the other heavy fighters. The Tizma has a surprisingly decent turn, basically a Su-6 that turns, climbs, speeds, and accelerates much better. The XP-55 is a really strong plane. It doesn't have the tightest circle but has an excellent energy retention and a sustained turn of 23 degrees per second, making it potentially better than the Yak-3 in a horizontal rate fight. Now on to planes from 2.7 to 3.7. For this set of planes I'll be comparing using the P39N0. As most of you guys probably know, this plane is incredibly strong in terms of its flight model for 2.7. Just comparing it to the BF-109 F4, it has a similar sustained turn, a higher top speed, better energy retention, and it compresses less. Its engine power does struggle above 2 km since it doesn't have a supercharger, and its firepower leaves a bit to be desired, but it's still incredibly strong. So let's take a look at how it compares to other planes at its BR. The A20 doesn't have the worst turn circle, but compresses very early and doesn't sustain turns very well. From my experience, it also feels pretty wonky to fly, but I guess you can't expect too much from this kind of a strike aircraft. The A36 has a very similar flight envelope to the P51D5 since it is a Mustang airframe after all. At 300 meters it goes surprisingly fast and turns pretty well, though as soon as you go above 500 meters you lose a lot of performance. The F4F has quite a tight turn circle but is very underpowered. It still at least has a decent sustained turn, but it climbs very poorly and can't go that fast. The early Corsairs are pretty fast and turn fairly well. Their turn radius and instantaneous turn are actually significantly better than the F4U4, but of course it has a weaker engine so it's slower, but it does have a similar sustained turn to the F4U4. The F6 F5 actually turns quite tight and has a decent sustained turn. Definitely better across the board in terms of flight performance compared to the F6 F5N, which is a lot heavier thanks to the radar and the 20mm that are mounted on it. The P36G has an excellent turn. When just looking at these graphs, it looks very similar to the A6 M3 in terms of sustained turn, turn radius, climb, and straight line speed, though it does compress earlier. Firepower is also lacking, but that's also pretty common at this tier. The P38G does everything worse than the P39 on the deck. It does perform much better than the P39 at high altitude though, and it does start with an air spawn, so it's still very good. The P40 has a very similar flight profile to the P51D, though significantly worse at everything, especially top speed. The P43 turns tight but doesn't climb that well and is pretty slow, like the F6F but slower. A bit surprising since I kind of assumed that it looked like a P47, so I just assumed that it would fly kind of similarly. And the P47 Razorback is surprisingly not that fast in a straight line, capping out at 550 kph. Its climb is not that bad and definitely workable with altitude and flaps, but it's also not the most competitive dogfighter. The P51 Hispano Stang is almost identical to the A36, though its engine starts to lose performance at 2 kilometers instead of 500 meters, so it's a lot more workable in that sense. The P51C is very strong, almost akin to the P51D10 in flight performance, though with a lower top speed and a slightly worse climb. It's one of my favorite planes to fly, and the only big downside of it is being the low damage output with only 450 cals. The P63 turns tighter than the P39, which is a bit surprising to me since I thought that the P63 was a heavier and up-engined plane, since it gets a supercharger. Compared to the C5, the A5 climbs a bit worse and is a bit slower, but is otherwise mostly the same. In terms of actual sustained turn and top speed though, it's either on par or worse still than the P39 N0. The SB2C turns very tightly and has a surprisingly decent sustained turn on the deck. It very much struggles with climbing, but as long as you make your air spawn count, this is largely a weakness that can be avoided. Very much an early game menace. The BF109E turns quite tight, climbs well, and has a good sustained turn, but compresses early and is not that fast. The BF109F2 loses a bit of that turn radius compared to the E, but still has a similar sustained turn and is a bit faster and compresses less. The BF110 is basically a slower ME410, and otherwise is practically the same in terms of sea level performance. The BV155 turns very well, basically on par with the Spitfire Mk V. It does have trouble rolling, and its climb is rather poor, and it also doesn't go very fast. And though that engine power is still pretty good at high altitudes, you rarely ever get to climb high enough for that to actually become a significant factor. The Do 217 doesn't have that bad of a turn radius, but compresses very early, doesn't go that fast, and has a poor retention and climb, so is another air spawn dependent plane. The first Focke-Wulf turns a bit tighter than the ones at 4.0, but has a weaker engine, so climb, speeds, and retains energy a bit worse. Not much else to say. The Ju-87 is similar to the SB2C, but doesn't turn quite as well. It also climbs and speeds a bit worse, but its bomber air spawn make those not that important. The I-16 turns very well, with a sustained turn on par with the Spitfire. It also climbs quite well, but it's also very slow and loses engine performance above 3 kilometers. So it's only really at 3.3 because its turn and its two 20mm Shavaks. The I-29 climbs quite well, especially for a plane with an air spawn, though it does compress quite early. Turn and straight line speed are not that bad, so it is pretty good. The Chaika is a biplane, so there's not much else to say here. Basically has the characteristics of an I-16 but cranked up to the max, so without a doubt it outturns the Zeros and basically every other plane at its BR. The I-185 M82 has a weaker engine than the M71, so it's slower and climbs a bit worse, but plays mostly the same as the one at 4.3, being a rather poor turner. The IL-2M is slow and actually doesn't turn all that well. It has somewhat of a tight circle, but doesn't otherwise do that well because its retention is poor, and its sustained turn is under 20 degrees per second. The IL-8 has a better engine but a chunkier airframe, so it has a better sustained turn and goes faster in a straight line, but compresses very early, so still not a very good dogfighter. The early IL-2 is a different beast, and it is better in every way compared to the IL-2M, turning tighter, sustaining better, and going faster. The climb is not as good, but you can still catch a lot of people off guard with its very good and very tight turn. The LA5FN is another sort of all-rounder plane, a decent turn, great climb, decently fast, and it recently had its flight model updated so it compresses less. Overall, pretty solid. The Lag3 also got a similar treatment where it compresses less now, so it's similarly a generalist plane as the LA5, with a good climb and turn. The Mk 34 seems to have an envelope very similar to the I-185, except it rips much earlier. For its BR, it climbs decently and starts with an air spawn, but doesn't turn all that well, so it probably would be best to boom and zoom with this plane. The PE3 is like the BF-110, but it turns a bit tighter and it goes a bit slower. Not much else to say. The Yak 7B and some of the earlier Yaks are very similar in characteristics to the later Yaks, in that they have a great climb, good turn, okay straight line speed, and somewhat early compression. Basically the Yak 9T that goes slower and compresses earlier. The Beaufighter seems quite solid as a heavy fighter. Decent turn, decent speed, decent climb. The Boomerang has similar performance to the F4F or a 109E4, but with a worse climb and speed. The Firebrand is similar to the P3 or the BF-110, even though it's a single-engine plane, so it's a little sad. The Firefly is a bit faster than the Firebrand, so it is a bit more workable in a dogfight, but it's still not that great. Once again, the Mosquito turns a bit and climbs a bit better than the Firefly. It's not the worst strike aircraft to try and dogfight in, but overall still not that competitive beyond using the air spawn at the start of the match. The Sea Hurricane turns quite well on the deck, not quite as well as the Spitfire, but still very good. The Spitfire Mark II has the same envelope as the Mark V-B, but has a weaker engine, so it goes a bit slower, climbs a bit worse sustained turn, but overall still very strong. The Vickers Tempest is very fast and has a good linear energy retention. Its straight line speed of 600 kph is on par with the P-51C, but it's not good enough to outrun other Americans in an up tier, or the Wyvern. It also doesn't turn that well, so it's mostly just a gimmick vehicle for its funny big guns. The Whirlwind is actually just the Mosquito, but with a lower top speed. It also compresses earlier, making it very difficult to boom and zoom people, and so its main advantage of having an air defense spawn is a bit neutered in that way. The A6M2, to no one's surprise, is only outturned by biplanes. It has a similar sustained turn to the A6M3 and the A6M2 Mod 33, but it compresses earlier, so it doesn't quite have as good of an instantaneous turn. The B7A2 doesn't turn as well as I expected, but it also goes a lot faster and climbs a lot better than I imagined. I had mentally categorized it along with the SB2C and the Ju-87, but it seems like it's a lot better rounded and more comparable to the fighter aircraft of its BR, which is very scary considering it has a bomber air spawn. If you have the Homare, the better engine will probably let it turn on par with the Spitfire and climb even better. The CW21 seems to climb and sustain turns very well, though is not that fast. Definitely between Spitfire and Zero in terms of sustained turn performance. The Key 102 is a pretty solid twin-engine fighter since it turns okay, climbs well, and is able to go decently fast, meaning it can use its air spawn quite effectively at the start of the match. The Key 108 turns better, but is slower than the 102. Either way, still quite workable. The Key 44 is absurdly powerful. It has a crazy climb rate, turns quite well, and is faster than the BF-109 F4 on the deck. Even if its climb was average, it would still be a very strong plane. It isn't just a turn-to-win kind of Japanese plane, but it's very much made up for by its strong engine performance. The early Key 61s have Spitfire tier turn and are quite strong since they have an okay speed as well. It's not quite as specialized as the Zero, and its roll is a bit slow, but overall it's still very fun to fly defensively. Also, it is straight up better than the Interceptor Key 61 Tay, apart from the firepower. The C205 is a solid all-rounder. Good climb, good speed, turn. It's actually significantly better than the C202 EC in everything except firepower. The IAR-81 turns okay, but climbs and speeds rather slowly. Just another underpowered low-tier aircraft. The Re.2001 seems to be a pretty good turner from this graph, but is limited by the fact that it overheats very easily and so cannot sustain these turns and climbs as well as shown here. The SM91 climbs a bit worse and compresses a bit earlier than the SM92, but otherwise turn and straight line speed seem the same. The 620mm are definitely overkill, so I do prefer the SM92, but the gunner on the 91 is pretty neat. The A35 turns okay for a bomber, but climbs poorly, kind of your average bomber used as a fighter aircraft. The D520 turns well, but is a bit slow. Nothing too special for its BR, other than the fact that it has very limited ammo, like all the other early French aircraft. The MB157 climbs, turns, and speeds quite well, keeping up with even the P39, which is quite impressive. Do keep in mind that it is 3.3 though. The MB175 turns surprisingly well for a twin-engine bomber. I haven't flown it myself, but I've heard a lot of fun things about it, so I should probably give it a spin. This is interesting. The P39Q25 looks like it's basically the N0 but with a worse top speed. This is because all the P39s have the same engine apart from the Russian P39K, and the Q has underwing guns that add 250 cals, which add weight and drag, slowing the P39Q25 compared to the N0. What's really absurd about this though is that the P39 N0 is at 2.7 and the Q35 is at 3.7. The only real advantage that the Q25 has is the 2 additional 50 cals, which I don't really know is worth it for the extra 1.0 BR increase. Truly another genius balancing move by the snail. The VG33 seems like another slow turner like the D520. Not quite as turn, but it's generally similar characteristics. The B239 turns very well and has characteristics that are almost identical to the A6M2, though not quite as turny. The J22B doesn't turn as bad as I remember, but it is still pretty poor in flight performance. It's only really at 3.7 because it has pretty strong guns. The Sakeen is, to no one's surprise, a big fat brick. On WEP, its flight performance is quite similar to the BF-110, and even that WEP runs out pretty quickly. So that's everything I tested. I hope you didn't watch this entire video because this is probably much better used as a reference for when you want to check the flight performance of a specific vehicle rather than just sitting through and like letting this all just kind of bleh through your brain. But if you did, you will have noticed that most of these graphs are filled with red, meaning that the P39 has the energy advantage in most situations against all of these aircraft. Just goes to show how under-tiered it is. Anyways, that's all for now. I'm probably not going to do another one of these for another month because it did take a while, and I am not very much looking forward to testing another set, but I will get around to it eventually when I feel like it. I don't really plan on doing anything below 2.7, so I'll probably do 4.7 to 5.3 next. But for now, say bye to Graph Thunder. I'll be doing other videos instead. Bye bye!